What happens when a coastal state gains a supersonic missile that can travel nearly 290 kilometers at sea-skimming altitude, while a major naval power concentrates forces offshore? Reports indicate that Iran is nearing a deal to acquire China's CM-302 anti-ship cruise missile, a system designed to outrun and outmaneuver shipborne defenses. If confirmed, the balance of power in one of the world's most militarized waterways could shift in ways that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. If the agreement is finalized, the strategic equation facing the United States Navy changes immediately. Carrier strike groups rely on layered missile defense systems calibrated for subsonic and some supersonic threats, but reaction times shrink dramatically when sea-skimming missiles approach at high speed. If negotiations collapse, deterrence remains largely unchanged. If they succeed, maritime risk premiums, regional insurance costs, and naval deployment patterns could all adjust within months, reshaping calculations from energy markets to alliance politics. To understand the stakes, you need the historical backdrop. Since the 1980s tanker war phase of the Iran-Iraq conflict, Tehran has invested heavily in asymmetric naval warfare, fast attack craft, mines, shore-based missiles, and anti-access doctrine focused on the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of globally traded oil passes. International sanctions beginning in 2006 under the United Nations restricted major arms transfers, but the 2015 nuclear agreement temporarily suspended parts of that regime before snapback measures returned in 2024. Within that cycle of restriction and relief, Iran pursued missile development domestically while seeking selective foreign technology. The reported system at the center of negotiations, the CM-302, is a supersonic export variant associated with Chinese aerospace firms and typically described as capable of terminal sprint speeds above Mach 2.5. With an estimated 290-kilometer range, it would extend coastal engagement envelopes deeper into the Gulf and potentially into the Arabian Sea if deployed forward. According to accounts cited by Reuters, talks began at least 2 years ago and accelerated after a 12-day confrontation between Israel and Iran in June. Senior Iranian officials, including Deputy Defense Minister Masoud Oraei, reportedly traveled to China as discussions entered advanced stages. Beijing's calculus is layered. China imports more than 10 million barrels of crude oil per day, a substantial share from the Middle East. It maintains annual naval drills with Iran and Russia, signaling maritime cooperation without formal alliance commitments. At the same time, Chinese authorities publicly state they enforce export controls on dual-use goods and deny awareness of specific missile transfer claims. For China, the benefits include strategic leverage in a region historically dominated by American naval power. The risks include secondary sanctions and reputational costs in European markets. Washington's position is equally complex. The White House has emphasized that Tehran faces a choice between negotiated constraints and unspecified severe consequences, referencing prior episodes of escalation. The U.S. Treasury previously sanctioned Chinese entities for supplying chemical precursors linked to Iran's ballistic missile programs, targeting networks associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. An operational CM-302 deployment would test the credibility of maritime deterrence at a time when U.S. naval assets are already stretched across the Indo-Pacific and European theaters. Now consider the first what-if scenario. If Iran fields even a limited number of supersonic anti-ship missiles integrated with coastal radar and targeting drones, US and allied vessels operating within 300 kilometers of Iranian shores would need to adjust patrol distances or invest further in electronic warfare and missile defense interceptors. Insurance underwriters could reassess transit risk through Hormuz, potentially raising costs for tankers. Gulf Arab states might accelerate procurement of additional air and missile defense batteries, intensifying a regional arms cycle. The second scenario moves in the opposite direction. If the deal stalls under diplomatic pressure or fear of sanctions, China preserves plausible deniability, while Iran continues relying primarily on indigenous systems such as the Noor and Qadr families, which are generally subsonic. In that outcome, the deterrence balance remains tense but familiar. However, the very publicity of the negotiations may already serve Tehran's signaling strategy, reminding adversaries that external suppliers remain options despite sanctions. There is also a broader geopolitical layer involving India. Critics argue that the government of Narendra Modi has struggled to translate strategic autonomy into coherent regional influence. India maintains energy ties with Gulf producers and invests in Iran's Chabahar port to access Central Asia, yet it has reduced Iranian oil imports under US sanctions pressure. Some analysts contend that inconsistent engagement left space for China to deepen security links with Tehran, including infrastructure under the 25-year cooperation framework announced in 2021. Supporters of Modi counter that balancing US partnerships with regional interests constrains policy flexibility. Whether labeled miscalculation or structural limitation, India's reduced economic footprint in Iran coincides with Beijing's expanding leverage. Globally, the implications reach beyond a single missile system. Supersonic anti-ship weapons compress decision windows to minutes, heightening escalation risks during crises. Energy markets, already sensitive to disruptions, could react sharply to any incident involving naval forces in confined waters. European and Asian importers would watch shipping lanes closely. Meanwhile, US-China rivalry would gain another maritime dimension, linking Gulf security to Indo-Pacific competition. In the end, this story is not solely about hardware. It is about how states signal resolve, hedge against vulnerability, and test the limits of sanctions regimes. Watch the timelines, confirmation of delivery schedules, evidence of training or integration, shifts in naval deployment patterns, and responses from regional capitals. Power at sea often changes incrementally before it changes suddenly. Whether this reported transfer becomes a transformative milestone or another episode in a long contest will depend on calculations unfolding quietly behind diplomatic doors.